Welcome to another exciting video for American history class. This one is going to be on Kennedy and the Cold War and his early presidential struggles that he had as a result of the Cold War. So 1960 was a huge year of turmoil in the United States. As I talked about in the last video, we had the U-2 incident where we had a spy plane that was shot down over the USSR, which was bad, and as a result of this, the Soviet Union forms an alliance with Cuba. Now, why would that make us nervous? Where is Cuba? Yes, it is very close to us. Good. I'm glad you all answered out loud my question. Yeah, I'm sure that happened. At any rate, U.S. citizens feared we were losing the Cold War because we were. They beat us into space with Sputnik. They developed the atomic bomb recipe much sooner than we had given them credit for and thought that they would. And so we started living in a daily fear that the Soviets were going to take over the world and communism would spread. And certainly with these couple of incidents, these were not exactly, this wasn't the way that we wanted to start this new decade of relations between the United States and the USSR. So we started off a really rocky road, and it basically just got worse after that. Kennedy sets foot on the scene, and he is a great candidate. He's got the looks, he's got a personality, he's got the Boston accent, he's young, he's got charisma. So he comes in and he's exciting for people. And one of the things that really helped him was his exposure on television. And I'll show you some pictures in just a second. But Kennedy came on as the young new guy, and Nixon wasn't super worried about him. I mean, obviously he was a competitive candidate, but Nixon had the experience, and he was kind of an old warhorse and knew what he was doing, so he wasn't super concerned about what was happening. But they had a television debate. It was the first television debate between presidential candidates, and depending on how you looked at or how you took in the debate, that would change the way that you, or the person that you thought won, because the people who watched on television truly believed that Kennedy had won, mostly because he carried himself well, he wasn't sweating, he had put on the makeup recommended by the people at the studio, and he was ready to be on television. He looked at the television as if he was speaking to the people that were watching, and Nixon refused to wear the makeup, didn't look at the camera as often, and got flustered and nervous a little bit. And so if you had listened or had followed the debate by radio, you thought wholeheartedly that Nixon had won the debate. If you watched the debate on television, you believed that Kennedy had won the debate. So the television exposure really helped Kennedy kind of set the stage for a very successful run for the presidency. Here is a picture of the television debate, and you can't really tell, but Nixon has, kind of those jowls that makes him look a little bit like a hound dog. But the images that were portrayed on television really replaced the printed word as how people were taking in politics. Shortly after this happened, there's the debate again, sorry. And another picture from the debate. More pictures. Woo! Here you go. Lots of pictures. Shortly after this happened, Martin Luther King was arrested, and the first thing that Kennedy did was call Coretta Scott King, who was Dr. King's wife, and said this is a travesty, and we should not be living in this time where whites and blacks are not equal. Eisenhower, who was president at the time, had no response, didn't react to the situation. It was a very well publicized incident that had happened, and Nixon had no comment on it. So again, this helped with the road to the presidency because it encouraged the African American vote among Kennedy supporters. Second thing that kind of helped launch Kennedy into the presidency was the idea for flexible response. He wanted to be ready for any kind of different military response to international crises rather than just focusing on nuclear weapons. So, if someone, if Sri Lanka is going to attack, Florida, we're not going to nuke Sri Lanka. We're going to take care of it and be ready for different military answers to different international crises. So that was one other thing that worked in Kennedy's favor, is that he had kind of a plan for the development of the military and reacting in different situations differently, excuse me, rather than just relying on nuclear weapons. Okay, so Kennedy is elected, and shortly thereafter we have a crisis in Cuba. Now, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba promising democracy. We helped support get Castro and get him to power. Batista was corrupt. He was the leader of Cuba before Castro, and the U.S. supported getting rid of this corrupt leader, not knowing that Castro was going to turn to communism after it ended. So the United States supported Fidel Castro and getting him to the presidency. And I'm going to pause. Okay, so we supported Fidel Castro, getting him into office to try and overthrow who we thought was the corrupt Batista. And then we realized that Castro was communist and was going to spread communism and wanted to encourage communism, and that was a bad situation for us. So Eisenhower, who was president before Kennedy, had set up and trained Cuban exiles to attack the Cubans who were in Cuba and try and overthrow Fidel Castro. And the plan was, a couple days before the Cuban exiles went in, they would have destroyed the communication towers so they'd have no idea that they were coming, and they would take over the Bay of Pigs and overthrow Castro. Well, the CIA had trained 1,400 Cubans and sent them to the island to attack, and had everything gone as planned, it probably could have been successful. However, the air communication towers had never been destroyed as they thought they had been 2 days before, and so waiting for these 1,400 Cuban exiles were 20,000 Cuban troops, who were also backed up by Soviet tanks and weapons. And so they killed a number of the Cuban exiles and captured the rest, and it was a huge disaster. And Kennedy went ahead with it. He found out about it 9 days after his election, that this was going to happen. And he said, okay, well, let's do it. Eisenhower was a military man. The CIA's behind it, so let's go for it. And it ended up being horrifically embarrassing for Kennedy because it was a failure. It was a complete failure, and it was his first huge, situation in office. And as a result of that, he was on kind of shaky ground with the public and the people of the United States, and had to kind of work his way out of their distrust. So we're having a crisis now because we did not want to have nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the Soviets had partnered with Cuba. They were 90 miles off the coast of Miami. It was a bad situation. We didn't want them there. They had bases and weapons in Cuba, and we wanted to keep them from coming. And so Kennedy isolates Cuba by having a blockade. And basically, the blockade was so thick, there were so many ships that were that close to each other that the line is that you could have run all the way around Cuba on these boat decks because they were so close to each other, and there were that many boats protecting. And what ends up happening is the Soviets send nuclear weapons to the United States via ship, and we start tracking these ships, and we know they're coming to Cuba. And Kennedy gets on the phone and talks to Nikita Khrushchev and says, you're not going to place any weapons in our country. It's not going to happen. And Nikita Khrushchev is kind of this badass warmonger who has all this experience, and he was there and present during, World War II and what have you. And he's like, who is this runny-nosed guy with a funny accent? I'm not going to listen to him. He doesn't scare me. No, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm coming with our ships. You should be ready. So Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged telegrams back and forth. And at one point, Khrushchev says a telegram that says, well, if you promise not to attack Cuba, we won't put our weapons there. And Kennedy doesn't respond. And then Khrushchev sends another telegram that says, well, actually, we will keep our weapons out of Cuba if you keep your nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Because at the time, ironically enough, we have nuclear weapons present in Turkey. And what country is Turkey very close to? Yeah, the Soviet Union. So they wanted us to pull our nukes out of Central Asia and we wanted, not to have nuclear weapons in Cuba. And Kennedy conveniently responded to the earlier telegram and said, hey, actually, we'll go with this. So we won't, attack, and life will be good, and what have you. And then Nikita Khrushchev says, no, actually, we're coming. We're coming. And my parents will talk about how on the news every night, as the ships got closer and closer to Cuba, they'd show on the news, where the nuclear weapons were. They're 500 miles off the coast of Cuba, 200 miles off the coast of Cuba, or whatever. And they would wait to see if this was going to be the end of the world. Because if the Soviets got all the way to Cuba, we knew that we would go, to the end. This is the brinkmanship. We're going to go to the brink and attack using nuclear weapons. So we watched and we waited, and the boats came, and we watched and we waited, and the boats came, and they came, and they came, and we were ready. Kennedy said, bring it, Khrushchev, I can handle you. And at, the last minute, the Soviet ships turned around and started heading back towards the Soviet Union. So the Soviets balked. Nikita Khrushchev, who was this warmonger who, was alive through World War I, World War II, the Soviet Civil War, was defeated by Kennedy and looked weak and was humiliated in his country. It was said, one of the quotes that was said about the situation, that was, we are eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow just blinked. The Soviets blinked. So Khrushchev was humiliated in his country and needed to take action to solve this situation and to get back some of his toughness or manliness, whatever you want to say. And so he decided that he was going to put up a wall in Berlin, and he was going to keep everybody out of East Berlin and East Germany, and that was his kind of response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, there you go.